Hi, Theory 2. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about motifs, phrases, and periods. When we use the word motif, we're talking about the very smallest identifiable musical idea. A good example of a motif is this. You really couldn't get much smaller than that. Another example of a motif would be in the Mozart G minor symphony. There's actually two motifs there. One is this little falling minor second, and the other is the leap of a minor sixth. Now, in large works, sonatas and concertos and symphonies especially, motifs usually undergo some kind of development and grow and change. That doesn't usually happen quite as much in a shorter composition. But in either case, the term motif applies to the smallest identifiable musical idea. Now, the phrase is called by our textbook a relatively independent musical idea terminated by a cadence. Let me try to put that in another way. A phrase is a unit of meaning within a melody. Melody can be made up of multiple phrases. A phrase is somewhat like when you're speaking to somebody and you've made your point, you take a breath, and then you go on. So, for example, here I am talking to all of my students in Music 122, and my subject today is going to be motives and phrases. So I had two spoken phrases there, and it works the same way in music. So let's go back to the Mozart for a minute. We already saw it's made up of two motifs, but if we put it together, we get a phrase. Sorry, one more time. Now, obviously, we're not going to end there. So Mozart adds a second phrase. And in doing that, he creates what's called a period. A period is basically a pair of phrases. The first one seems to ask a question. Usually the second one seems to provide an answer. The college term is antecedent consequent phrases. So, very clearly, it's up in the air. Now, we wind up there with an imperfect authentic cadence, which brings that idea to a close, at least for the moment before it moves on. So that's the concept of the phrase and the period. Now, the textbook also talks about subphrases, but for our purposes, we're not going to get that picky. Okay, I don't think we need to do that. Now, there's different types of periods. One type of period is called a parallel period. And this happens when the two phrases, phrase A, phrase B, begin much in the same way. So this is a song by Schubert. Both phrases begin identically, like this. A and B start the same. The only difference is that phrase A ends on a half cadence, whereas phrase B ends on a 5 to 7 perfect authentic cadence. Parallel period. Now, another type of period is called a contrasting period. This happens when the two phrases A and B do not start alike, don't seem to imitate each other very much at all. So, for example, this is from a Beethoven violin sonata. Missed that one. Let's try this again. Phrase A. Okay, that's the first phrase. We end on a half cadence. Now we start the second phrase, entirely different material. Second phrase ends with a perfect authentic cadence, but very different. That is what's called a contrasting period. Third, we can have a 3-bar or 3-phrase period, I should say, which some people call a phrase group. It kind of depends on whose textbook you're reading. But here's an example from the textbook. This is from The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. This is the aria, beautiful aria, Voi che sapete, which is sung by Cherubino. That's one phrase. It ends on 5, so it ends on a half cadence. Now, here's the second phrase. It also ends on 5, so we need to have another phrase to finish it up. Here's the third. And there's our PAC, perfect authentic cadence. So in that case, we've got 2 antecedents and 1 consequent. That's a 3-phrase period. Now, lastly here, I want to talk about a double period. A double period is usually when we have 4 phrases that divide into 2 pairs. So it's almost like you have 2 periods. Double period. Here's Beethoven. Okay, that's very clearly a cadence on 5. That's the first phrase. Here's the second. That also ends on 5. So here's the third. Yet again, ending on 5 half cadence. Only with the 4th phrase and the second phrase of the second period do we have a sense of closure. This stuff is in the textbook if you'd like to take a look. I started on page 150 and then I moved ahead and played you page 155 with Schubert, page 156, 157, the Beethoven and the Mozart, and 159, which was the piece I just played by Beethoven, a piano sonata, opus 26, number 1. Okay. Lastly, I will mention something called a sentence. The sentence is an unusual sort of thing. It's possible to use musical features other than cadences to make a structural unit. What a sentence basically is when you immediately repeat something or you create a variation of a musical idea. So almost like a repeated phrase. But then after that, you move towards a cadence. So as the text says, unlike the period, a sentence is typically, though not always, a single phrase in length. So here would be an example. This is Beethoven. Now, that is not one phrase, that's actually two, but you can hear what Beethoven does. He gives us this idea and then repeats it in sequence, just a step higher, and then immediately moves towards a cadence on 5. Now he does the same thing. And now he moves to the end. I admit that some of these things are a little hard to figure out, and sometimes we can argue, well, what is this thing anyhow? Not everything falls nice and neatly into 2-bar and 4-bar phrases, but oftentimes it does in the tonal period, and so that's what we're taking a look at. Thank you, and I will see you soon.